Yeah, headed to ATL, my second home. Literally going to the airport, houses over there, literally crossing the street, as you can see. And yeah, just hop on the train, take me to the airport no more than 20 something or 30 minutes. And hop on a flight, should be in Atlanta before 7 p.m. It's about 2 now, something like that. So yeah, stay tuned. Yeah, I just got to the train station and you see, waiting for the train, and I forgot my shades. Yeah, so it's all good, but I got my mask on me though. We'll see. All right, stay tuned and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.
Yes, I am back. Settled in Atlanta. Trip was great. Had my meetings and I had some downtime, and I checked out this underrated movie, Tetris. Oh my God, it brought so much memories. As in my early teens or pre-teens, I was in a boarding house, at a school called Mountain Gabriel's, and I snuck in the Game Boy. And one of the cartridges was Tetris. And I also played a lot of Mario Brothers, and that helped my creativity a lot, and my imagination went wide. And so when I saw this movie Tetris, I was like, whoa, this is nostalgia, Tetris is a movie about this American programmer who lived in Japan at that time. He went all the way to Russia to track down this other programmer who actually made the game Tetris. Yeah, this brought a lot of memories, and I really enjoyed the film. I feel like it's an adventure. So we're gonna react to the film. Let me know what you guys think.
Rivals raced against time to gain rights to Tetris in the 2023 film, but not everything in the film was fact. Car chases, licensing lawsuits, and KGB's involvement. It all sounds dramatized, but was it really? Here's the fact from fiction to how the blocks really fell. In Tetris, viewers are told that Russian programmer Alexei Pajitnov, played by Nikita Efremov, invented the game on a primitive computer. But there is much more to the man and how he made one of the most popular video games of all time. In the film, Pajitnov is working in part for the trade bureau Elorg, but in actuality, he was employed by the Russian Academy of Sciences, a think tank of scientists, writers, and philosophers who were often given far more freedom than most. In the mid-1980s, Pajitnov was working on early efforts into developing artificial intelligence. He had a passion for computer game design and often used the availability of new hardware to dabble in programming his own puzzles. When it came to the original game of Tetris, Alexei Pajitnov was heavily inspired by a game from his youth called Pentamenos, a generic block game in which players rearrange different shapes, constructed out of 5 squares to make a solid rectangle. One look at the game, and it's hard not to recognize it as the inspiration for Pajitnov's digital masterpiece. Pajitnov's first attempt was essentially a computer translation of Pentamenos, but he soon landed on the idea of falling game pieces that could be rotated. But when he added the feature of completed rows disappearing, Tetris was truly born.
Why can't both lines disappear at once instead of one at a time?
Because I never thought of that.
When Tetris came to the Nintendo and Game Boy in the 1980s, it became an instant classic. But these ports certainly weren't the first time anyone played the game outside of the Soviet Union. While the film largely passes that part of the game's history, the real arrival of Tetris in the West is fascinating. As it's repeatedly mentioned in the film, the rights to the game on computers had been acquired by Robert Stein and licensed to Microsoft, a key video game publisher in the United Kingdom throughout the 1980s. They successfully launched the game in the UK for computers, but they weren't its only manufacturer. This is something the movie never mentions. In fact, Tetris wound up being successfully released in the United States by Microsoft's subsidiary Spectrum Holobyte, selling more than 100,000 copies. To market the game, Spectrum Holobyte decided to embrace the game's Russian roots, using box art with Cyrillic text and images of the iconic St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, enticing Western gamers with a small peek behind the Iron Curtain. The film opens with Hank Rogers, played by Taron Egerton, attending an electronics expo and trade show, unsuccessfully hawking his video game version of the classic Chinese board game Go. While there, his hired helper is distracted by a booth showing off Tetris, which lures him over to reluctantly try it. While it is true that Rogers developed the title for Nintendo based on Go, what the movie doesn't say is that, at the time, Rogers primarily made his living by looking for titles to import to Japan. Discovering Tetris was exactly why he went to those trade shows in the first place.
Microsoft control all rights on all platforms worldwide. Is Japan available?
Rogers claimed that he spotted Tetris in the 1988 Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, where Spectrum Holobyte was showing off their Russian puzzle game. He would explain years later, Tetris was probably the quietest game at the show. This game was a totally different thing. I wanted to play it because it struck some basic chord. I couldn't stop playing. Allegedly, Rogers was so entranced by the game, he got back in line to play it over and over, convinced that Tetris was precisely what the Japanese market was craving. Apple TV's Tetris is a dramatic reenactment of Hank Rogers' trip to the Soviet Union and his negotiations for the Japanese rights to the titular video game. It's revealed at the film's climax that Sofia Lebedeva Sasha, who Rogers randomly picked out of a crowd to serve as his translator, is actually an undercover KGB operative. This reveal is meant to throw the audience for a loop, but it might surprise viewers to learn that in reality, Rogers' Russian interpreter did turn out to be a KGB agent. However, unlike in the film, it was no secret. When the real Hank Rogers took his trip to Russia, the woman he hired was named Ola. As Rogers wrote in an editorial for The Guardian in 2014, he did pick her from a group of people in the lobby of his hotel, though the major difference between the movie and history was that Rogers was very much in the know that he was surrounded by agents of the state. They were all KGB, but Ola was beautiful and very perky when everybody else was doom and gloom. Just as in the film, Ola took Rogers to Elor, but according to Rogers, Ola refused to enter the building room, and her part in his negotiations ended there. The film's notion that she worked with Elor to intimidate him or was involved in a sinister government plot was totally fabricated. Set mostly in 1988, the Tetris film sees Hank Rogers attempting to secure the rights to produce the game for the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan. However, he is told early on by Nintendo's CEO to visit their subsidiary in Seattle, Washington. When there, he discovers their American team working on a prototype for the Game Boy. Company lawyer Howard Lincoln, played by Ben Miles, tells him they're planning on releasing it with a handheld version of their biggest franchise, Super Mario Land. Believing that it'll help sell the new system to a broader audience, Rogers suggests that the Game Boy be packaged with Tetris instead. The truth was that Stein was working on handheld rights for Microsoft, prompting Rogers to hop on a plane to secure the rights on his own. In one pivotal scene in the film, Rogers helps Nikolai Belikov, the company director of Elorg, understand how Microsoft was able to acquire video game rights to the game without realizing it. He points out that computers were never explicitly defined, and gives him advice on how to ensure the mistake doesn't happen again. But according to the real-life Hank Rogers, his involvement in restructuring contracts for Belikov and Elorg was more far-reaching than simply helping him to find computers. To get what he was looking for, Rogers knew he had to be open and helpful. And part of that openness meant drafting a contract that was favorable to both sides. With Rogers eschewing typical hard-selling negotiations, the Russians eventually granted him console rights. He told The Guardian in 2014, "I gave them the best contract I've ever seen in the industry. Clear, concise, no bullshit," partly because there wasn't time for any renegotiations. Not only was the new contract helpful to Rogers getting the rights he needed, it was also helpful to Belikov and Elorg, with Rogers claiming Elorg used the Tetris negotiations as a template for all their other deals. But this didn't sit well with the Maxwells, who, as shown in the film, often used the Soviets' negotiating inexperience with capitalists to their advantage. Some of the most intense moments in the film involve Belikov's attempts to outwit his three Western rivals, Robert Stein, Hank Rogers, and Kevin Maxwell, who were all in Moscow competing to get console and handheld rights. Belikov repeatedly pits the three parties against each other, keeping them separated and using information from them to squeeze out a better deal. While this is partly true, the movie portrays Belikov as a largely naive official who hasn't a clue who Hank Rogers is or what he wants. Truth, Belikov was alerted to his arrival by government agents.
You don't walk into a place like that uninvited. You have to have an invitation, and then your invitation has to be cleared with the KGB.
Similarly, the movie includes a corrupt KGB agent, played by Igor Grabyuzov, who blackmails the Maxwells and forces Belikov to sign the rights away to Microsoft. This kickstarts a complicated scheme where Pajitnov sends a covert fax to Rogers to help him steal back the rights. The real-life negotiations weren't quite as dramatic. While it is true that the Maxwells tried to exert pressure on Belikov by calling in favors from Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the USSR, in reality there was no nefarious KGB blackmail scheme. Belikov favored Rogers because of the man's honesty. Alexei Pajitnov also played a much larger role in negotiations than the movie suggests, pushing Belikov to give Rogers the rights. Really because Belikov requested they come along. He needed help in order to convince his contacts in the Russian government that working with Nintendo was simply the better deal. Sure, every film needs to end somewhere, and the Tetris movie didn't have the time to dramatize what ultimately happened to the game and the people involved. But even with a handful of real-life photographs and a few brief updates during the credits, the film mostly glosses over what happened to Rogers and Pajitnov after Tetris became a cultural phenomenon.
So what do you guys think? Do you think Tetris is worth watching? Do you think it's an underrated film? Please leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next review. Thank you.